Continuing on the theme of EEG, I'd like to introduce Professor Nathan Intrator from Neurosteer.
Thank you. It's a great honor to talk after Professor Emery Brown. I think he's one of the few that demonstrating how extremely important signal processing and advanced signal processing is for EEG, this 100-year-old signal, and apparently we can still learn a lot about it. So let's get started here. To set up the stage, I want you to try and imagine that you go to the general physician office for an annual checkup, or maybe to Walgreens, and within 12 minutes of a test, a very easy to administer test with a very simple device that is put on your head, basically a sensor, something like this on your forehead. The doctor receives a report that tells him whether you have a preclinical or an early situation of cognitive decline, a preclinical condition of a beta amyloid buildup, or an early condition of dopamine depletion. Sounds very easy to imagine, but still very difficult to perform. In order to answer this question nowadays, we need very expensive scanning, fMRI, PET-CT, etc. And usually to get an answer takes, on average, between 2 to 3 years per patient. We are hoping to change that with a very simple device, as you can see there, and with a very simple test that can be administered really in the clinic and outside of the clinic. And all this with a very simple device. So what is advanced here? What is advanced is the signal processing that is making the big change with respect to the standard. So I mentioned already that this EEG is a 100-year-old signal. I mean, actually the famous work was done in 1924 about EEG. So it turns out that one can still do quite a bit. So this is a traditional EEG, and it is really demonstrating that several frequencies, Hans Berger demonstrated that in 1924, that several frequencies have to do with specific brain functions, and Professor Emery Brown showed that beautifully on the anesthesia and sleep, etc. But it turns out that you can extract much, much more from that signal. You can extract with what is called an orthogonal decomposition that is based on harmonic analysis. And this is something that Professor Ronald Koifman from Yale started in the early 90s. That's kind of a generation after wavelets, which were kind of the first practical time frequency analysis. He demonstrated that you can then adapt the decomposition, and this is what we are doing to the brain. So the simple analogy of what we are doing can be seen in this example, because each one of us can do it. We can be in an orchestra room, and we can listen to the whole orchestra with a single ear, and then we decompose in our brain the different musical instruments. And so if the trumpet and the violin are playing at the same time, this does not bother us because we decompose them. And I specifically mentioned the violin and the trumpet because their fundamental frequency is pretty much the same, and it is the harmonics that actually makes a difference between what we call a metallic sound of the trumpet and the warm sound of violin. And this is what we are doing to the brain, because we look at different functional brain networks as different musical instruments, and then we can listen to them with a single EEG channel, and then do this decomposition to separate between the functional neural networks. So the outcome of what we do is we separate the signal into, at this point, into 120 different components. In the first few years that I talked about that, I presented those components, and then in the last 2 years we focused on the advanced high-level biomarkers that come out of those components. Today I'm going to talk both on the biomarkers and those components. So I believe that this is all clear, that the brain is a chorus of 100 billion neurons, and then of course there's groups of them which are part of networks, specific networks, and we can simply separate these networks. That's the key. So what do we do more specifically? There's an unsupervised part. I'll present that separately. That unsupervised part, we collected a large set of EEG signals from a lot of people, and in a totally unsupervised way, namely ignoring what it is that they were doing, we adapted or we created that orthogonal decomposition that is most adaptive, most optimized to reading the brain. This is similar to what a baby will do in the first year or two when they are listening suddenly to a voice and, of course, to music, and then they're creating exactly those features that can enable them to read and to understand this kind of new sensory input. The second slide is a little more involved. But basically it's separated into two topics. So the first one is the unsupervised, that part where we create those features. Then there's the supervised part that is kind of standard machine learning to use labels, specific labels. Would it be people labeled with depression or people labeled with Alzheimer's, to now recombine those features into and the ability to predict those. And then there are parts about statistical to make it more robust, to do a better model selection and model validation. So with that, we are really building a platform that can do a lot with the interpretation of brain activity, but I'm going to mainly concentrate today on cognitive decline and cognitive in general. Every once in a while, I'll put some fun pictures because we are doing all sorts of projects outside of the medical field to really demonstrate that this can be very, very useful. So at the beginning, I'm going to talk about two biomarkers that we have created with this technology. And of course, as there are new biomarkers, we have to try and validate them. So I'm going to talk about VC9 and A0. Don't ask me about the name. It's like historical reasoning for the names. I cannot support the names. So this is work done at Tel Aviv University, and we are demonstrating that when the students are listening to stimuli that is supposed to mimic NBEC, either with numbers and later with music, we can actually see that this biomarker goes up as the cognitive load, as the working memory cognitive load goes up. So we are trying to establish this correlation with memory cognitive load. And in several more projects at Tel Aviv University, we demonstrate that with other tasks, interruption, so we can see what happens to this biomarker when there is interruption, and we can see the correlation with the level of interruption and in other ways that are shown here, both the numerical NBEC and the musical NBEC. And I should say that we use music in two ways, but one of them is really to provide stimulus to the brain. So people that are doing our tests say that, well, maybe the test was difficult, but it was very pleasurable, and that's, of course, very important. In a task of learning, this is a project of interns, student interns, medical students who learn to operate a laparoscopic device, and we want to see how well they learn. And it turns out that VC9 can help us in predicting their learning ability. And we played with all sorts of parameters there, the speed and the time of learning, etc. You can see the correlation. So the graph on the right shows the correlation of single students, how they perform, how their performance improves as this parameter VC9 goes down. So in that case, once they perform better, VC9 goes down, and you can see a very, very strong correlation. This is a graph that I don't think a lot of other people reading EEG can put. We worked with a team of 16 top gymnastics girls that are performing their exercises, and you can see the device. This is the device that you can see attached to their body there. They were performing a number of exercises, and as you can see from the title, we were interested in the imagery. Okay, so we were interested to see what happens if they imagine the exercise that they do, and what does that can tell us about their performance. And this is the result. Oops. This is the result of them making an imagery of their exercise, and not only doing that, but trying to think how a third party is going to look at them when they're performing the exercise. We needed to do dynamic time wrapping to correlate between the performance of the exercise and the imagination of the exercise. But the non-trivial result is that these 16 top gymnasts, having 4 different trainers for each one of them, we asked the trainers to rank those gymnasts based on their ability to learn new performance and their performance. And it turns out that there was a strong correlation between the ranking of the trainers of the performance of these girls and their ability to imagine what they were doing. So, as I said, this kind of almost concludes my work on healthy subjects, and then we move to non-healthy ones. This is a project we did with Stanford on reading the brain of neurosurgeons. Surgeons in general, not just neurosurgeons. We collected more than 200 patients 200 surgeons within 3 days of the conference. Here you see them performing this test, this cognitive test, the 12-minute test that I mentioned. And here you see them actually performing some kind of simulated actually surgery where they were measured on their performance on the surgery. And something that Emery Brown alluded to, there's a big difference between young and older people, even if they are at top performance and still performing even surgeries. And what we can see here is that as the difficulty of the task, for example, of NBEC goes up, we see a very clear increase in the young ones. We see that in the 45 to 60, but when it goes above 60, the picture changes a little bit. And one aspect of our testing is what's called resting activity, or trying to look at their cognitive part of the brain as they are in a resting state, or listening, for example, to meditative music. And we see that there's a difference between the young ones and the older ones. This is more emphasized here, where I'm now switching to the second biomarker, A0, which appears to be more informative when we are looking for cognitive decline. So if you look at the graph on the left, you see a huge difference between the value, the level of that biomarker at young people, and then healthy seniors, and then seniors that are beginning to have cognitive decline. And that suggests that we may be able to tell at a very early stage whether there is a beginning of a cognitive decline. And this is a second graph of that nature that demonstrates the differences on the different groups of cognitive decline. and the correlation with the mini-mental test. The mini-mental test is the current state of the art, is not perfect and kind of has quite a bit of variability between doctors or clinicians who administer it. We see a correlation, better correlation to the mini-mental than to MoCA, which is another test. We are hoping to really provide an automatic test that will be more objective and more accurate. On comatose patients, we see an amazing correlation of the first biomarker, VC9, with what's called mismatch negativity. So in comatose patients, mismatch negativity is used as a clinical test to determine whether they are minimally conscious, whether non-responsive, completely non-responsive, etc. And we see here with the TDCS, with a study that provided stimulation to those patients, we can see that we are highly correlated with changes and with improvement in mismatch negativity as a result of TDCS. And so far I talked about the biomarkers and demonstrated what they can do. I want to go back now to those features, to those 120 features that I mentioned, and actually look at them in a totally different way. So that takes me to connectivity analysis. As Professor Brown showed beautifully, there is a connection between different regions, for example, the frontal area and the thalamus. And this connection is extremely critical because we not only want to see that each instrument in the orchestra is playing well, but we actually really want to see that they're all playing together. And in the orchestra, we have a conductor. There's something like a conductor in the frontal area of the brain, and sometimes that conductor stops performing what they need to do. And then we see a disruption in the connectivity between the different functional neural networks. This is usually done, this kind of connectivity analysis is usually done with fMRI or with multi-electrode EEG or with EEG after ICA, independent components analysis. And so the idea of doing it from a single EEG channel sounds a bit crazy, but actually why not? Because we are decomposing into these components, and of course we can now look at the correlation between these components. So the connectivity analysis itself, by the way, I'm now showing one of those slides of those components, and I should say that unlike a spectrogram, which is ordered by the frequency, so we go from low frequency to high frequency. Here, this representation is reordered so that different lines are close geographically if they are closely correlated as well. And of course, this was done on the healthy set of subjects that we created this, and soon we'll see what happens otherwise. But in terms of the connectivity or causality, we can use the standard tools that have been used for fMRI and for standard EEG. So let's look at this result. You can imagine that it's difficult to represent connectivity of 120 units, okay? Usually when this is done with fMRI, they're talking about 3 or 4 different networks and looking at the connectivity of these networks. Here, in order to represent in a simple slide the connectivity between those 120 units, we project them onto a 2-dimensional data so that the distance between the different points that you see on the screen is proportional to the correlation. Namely, if they're closer to one another, they are more correlated. The numbers and the colors coincide, so if you cannot read the numbers, you can see that we start from red and go to blue. And so you can see that the reds are very close to one another, and then comes the yellow and the greens and the blue. And this is in 3 groups of healthy subjects. what happens with other subjects. So the group on the left is actually the amazing gymnast that I mentioned before. The second group is young kids with epilepsy. And the third group is seniors with atrial fibrillation. So still no problem with the brain. What happens when we are looking at a problem with the brain? Now the picture is quite fascinating, and I have to say that this slide represents quite a bit of work, and as you can see from multiple different collaborations. On the left, we see patients with beta amyloid buildup. And you can see, if you focus on the green numbers or the green components, you can see that they're totally moved to the left. So this is beta amyloid buildup even before there is a preclinical, a clinical condition. And you can see why this could be very, very useful for screening, for massively screening for patients in order to administer the new drugs that have been approved and are going to be approved in that area needed to slow them down. The graph in the middle is people with with dopamine depletion as being tested with PET, with the F-DOPA test. And the graph on the right is people with more advanced Parkinson's. So you can see now that there is a very clear disruption in the connectivity when this buildup in the brain starts to occur, and of course at a more later state. I mentioned this result about beta amyloids. This was a project with Novartis. They tested 10 different technologies aiming to early detect the buildup of beta amyloids. Some of them were using the retina, looking at the retina in different ways, because as you know, the retina is an extension of the brain and it can tell us something about the brain. Some of them were using tablets. We were the only ones using EEG there, and we were able to demonstrate this quite nicely. This F-DOPA, if we're going back to the biomarkers, A0 appears to be quite informative with F-DOPA as well. But of course, when you have the 120, you get much more accuracy. We were asked by the person, Professor Tanja Gurevich, who gave us 6 people who were negative in the F-DOPA, whether we can say something on them. And we can see that. So on the left here, we see the F-DOPA positives. In the middle, we see the F-DOPA negatives. And as you can see, they are slightly different than the healthy subjects that you can see on the right. And that can tell you something about what is happening there. Testing it appears to produce very nice results. This is training on a totally different group than the group we tested on, and the performance is quite good. So this is quite promising. How much time do I have?
9 minutes.
Oh, okay. So perfect. Let me show just 1 or 2 more slides of what we are doing in other areas outside of cognitive. The device can, as it provides real time, it is perfect for monitoring patients in the ICU, definitely patients that are anesthetized and sedated and ventilated. And the guidelines there are that the sedation should be extremely light, and Professor Brown pointed out to the fact that many times when the sedation, when the anesthesia is too high, it does cause quite a bit of brain damage. Now you can think of a person who is lying for 5 or 6 or 10 days in the ICU and is being sedated. Of course, there's a very strong potential for brain damage there, and this is something that we are focusing on. You can see here 6 panels going from top left to bottom right of a patient. At the beginning, you see our version of sedated patients, and you can see a strong reduction in all of the activity. The red bumps have to do with the machines that are the ventilation machines and noise. What's interesting on the top right is a sedated patient, lightly sedated patient in the ICU, that's a COVID patient, that is listening to music, or basically listening to our cognitive assessment, and we can see some kind of response in that brain, and that actually tells us that the sedation is light. Right after that, the panel after that shows the brain response of that patient when he's is doing what's called sedation interruption, or stopping the sedation for about an hour. The guidelines say that this has to be done every day. And now we can actually administer the cognitive test and basically tell whether they have delirium, and delirium is one of the biggest problems and the most costly problems in the ICU. At the bottom two lines, we see that actually that patient is now starting to have difficulty breathing after being woken up, and they had to be re-sedated. Switch to something much more relaxing. Is the monitoring of the marathon just before the beginning of COVID here in New York. And what we see here is Professor Stephen Lowry's and his son. We were able to monitor them for 5 hours with this device. Stephen Lowry's, you can see on his shirt maybe, that he had 3 different EEG devices that he was going to run with, but in the early trials they realized that the other 2 devices are too noisy and there's no way that they can provide any information. So he ran only with our device. That was quite a difficult job to, of course, demonstrate that we are much less sensitive to muscle activity and movement, and marathon is, of course, one of those. To demonstrate that we are less sensitive to sweat and to have the electrodes still read the brain under extreme sweat. To overcome the 5,000 Bluetooth devices that were next to them from the cheering crowd. But we were able to air this in real time on Facebook. You can still see that, to actually demonstrate that Stephen Lowry's, who is advocating meditation, as you could see before, was actually getting into the flow, or actually meditating the whole time, while his son, who was in much better shape, was actually much more nervous and agitated during the run. So to summarize, what we want to do is to provide a very, very simple device that can be massively deployed, that does not require a clinician to administer, and basically, just like a blood test, can, with a single test, can start providing several answers to what kind of potential conditions the brain has. We were talking about cognitive decline, but of course, anxiety and depression are down the line to really be able to help. And I'm hoping that next time I show this slide, I'll be able to put more logos of pharma companies, because we believe that this is very critical for the pharma to do screening, to have a very affordable screening of their patients for their clinical trials, and then, of course, to screen patients that would need those drugs. Thank you very much. Emery Brown is doing such great work on sleep. There's no need to change that. We are doing stuff around coma, around sleep stages, around anesthesia, so yes. But we focus on the cognitive aspects mainly. We actually have a paper that demonstrates what happens to those cognitive biomarkers, both in sleep and in anesthesia. Thank you. Thank you.